Hello again from the TPS Southern Region, and welcome to another how-to webinar. Today, our topic is how to analyze a secondary source. So let's get started. First of all, we have to define what do I mean by a secondary source. So basically, for the purposes of this webinar, we're going to talk about secondary sources as based on primary sources. So that's kind of obvious. Using primary sources as evidence to construct a narrative that tells a story, whether it's a history book or, a book about another topic. So let's look at an example. Here we have a page from a PhD thesis from 1915 about Benjamin Franklin and his trip to Germany. And so what about this makes it a secondary source? Well, let's take a look. First of all, we have footnotes, which is always a good sign. Maybe sometimes they're endnotes. And these particular footnotes reference this first one, for instance, original letter in the Museum of Independence Hall. So that's a primary source. The second footnote references the collection of the Honorable Pennypacker printed in a book about Benjamin Franklin. So that probably is another primary source collection. And then this third one references the private correspondence of Benjamin Franklin. So that would have referenced a letter that he wrote or some other official correspondence. And you may have noticed that there's a strange order of the footnotes going 687 instead of 678. I think that must be a printing error because I've never seen that before. But in any case, this person clearly consulted primary source collections in libraries, both in the US and in Germany, and used them to write the story about what happened during Benjamin Franklin's trip to Germany. So that makes it a secondary source. So what kinds of secondary sources can you find at the Library of Congress website? Well, that would be an example of a book or other kind of printed material. These are both online and then sometimes as catalog references or bibliographic references to books. Essays and articles. We've looked at some of these in a previous webinar. And some video presentations too, which are kind of like an article, but in video format. So let's look at some examples. For starters, the research guides at the Library of Congress, which I'm going to go to my browser screen now. So research guides are a good place to find secondary sources on a particular topic. Sometimes they'll take you to online ones, and sometimes they will recommend print ones. For example, there's always this tab for print resources on the left-hand column. And then this will show you secondary sources that you can go check out from your local library. These would be written by historians, maybe journalists, other kinds of scholarly researchers who would base their stories both on primary sources and, if you're a good researcher, you're also going to be using other secondary sources because it's unavoidable. All right, so how would you analyze a secondary source? Well, for starters, there's a really good resource online that I've been using for a long time with my students. It's from Bowdoin College. It's called Reading, Writing, and Researching for History. And there are a couple really quick strategies that are easy to remember under the tab How to Read a Secondary Source. One uses the acronym STAMP, where it stands for structure, thesis, argument, motives, and primaries. So those are the primary sources. But another good way is to treat it like it's a primary source and analyze it that way. So here we have a happy worksheet that you can get from our website. If you go to our Tools for Educators analysis worksheets and guides, it's right, the third one down under there. So for example, this is another acronym. You can use this for primary sources or secondary sources. So what is the historical context? Because Even books written by historians are written in a particular context. What is the audience for that? That will affect the purpose, which is the third thing to look for. What is the author's point of view? What do you need to know about their background that will help you make sense of how they're telling the story? And then I don't know why stands for significance, but for the purposes of this worksheet, it does. So what is the, so what? What is the, how does this book fit into the larger bibliography of other books written on the same topic? So that's another way that you can start using this with maybe kind of students or other kind of beginners. So let's look at another example. First of all, I want to tell you about a strategy that's called outside in, where, excuse me, you would look at a book from the outside in. So you look at the covers first, you look at title, subtitle, any kind of pictures, author's name. This one has a book award on it. It also will tell you some sort of quotation from the publisher, perhaps. On the back, there'll be a blurb and perhaps a quote from another author that's endorsing it, some sort of brief bio of the authors of this book, for instance. And so that's how you start. And I haven't even started reading this book yet, and I can already get clues about what it's going to be telling me and why. And then you can move in and look at the title page, the date of publication, which is very important, the location where it was published, what kind of index or bibliography does it have at the back, how does it list its footnotes, what's in the table of contents, for instance. And then something very important is, I still haven't gotten to the text yet, what is in like a preface or a foreword or an introduction. So we're going to look at an example of that right now. Online. This is one of the books that you can find in one of our primary source that's on the New South, which of course is referring to the southern states after the Civil War in the late 19th century when they're trying to reinvent themselves during the Second Industrial Revolution and focus on the economy. And so if we do that with this one, we can see the date, we can see from the subtitle what it's, going to be about. Looking at these states both all together and separately, their characteristics, it's 1887. And then the preface will give clues also that we can use to analyze this. So it says the book represents in a measure aspirations long cherished by the author to do something of service for the South, his adopted loved home. Right away in the first sentence, we gather a lot of information. For instance, this person is not from the South originally, but moved there, is very fond of the South, and is doing this to help the South during this period. So that's a lot about its motives. If we kind of scroll down a little bit, for this paragraph here, it says, it will be observed that much of the material is taken from the reports of the last 10th census of the United States. So claiming what primary sources they're basing their narrative on. And that's very important is for them to point out and for you to also notice when you're analyzing. And so, okay, well, let's look at some other examples. We're going to go back to the Benjamin Franklin pieces. So if I'm searching for Benjamin Franklin, I'll come up with a ton of hits. So let's say I just want to look at what books are written about him. There's a way that you can filter that out. On the left-hand side, you just click Book, Printed Material. And then I narrowed it down even further because I noticed that there was this one decade at the beginning of the 20th century where a particularly large number of books were written about him. So I would want to kind of save that as a question that I would want to ponder. So the 19 teens. So here we see the Benjamin Franklin and Germany PhD thesis. Well, let's look at these other two first examples and see what we can glean from just looking at prefaces or introductory material. So I am human. Yay. All right. One thing that I like to do is when I'm looking at a book, I like to view all the images in a sequence because then you can kind of tell where's the best place to start. But before you land on the very beginning of the text, you have all this other stuff to get through. See, we aren't even at the beginning of the story yet. So all of these things will give us clues that we can use to analyze. For instance, there's a picture of him, and this is something I might have flipped right by if I were reading this book in person. It's a part of a series, so that's another question you want to find out. The Beacon Biographies of Eminent Americans. So that gives us a clue as to what the take is going to be on Benjamin Franklin here. So let's say we finally found the preface and we're going to take a closer look. This author says, this is not a biography of Benjamin Franklin, nor is it a critical survey of his relations to and services for the young nation, of which he was, to use the language of his day, a veritable nursing father. It is more than anything else a series of impressions, brought, I trust, into some kind of harmony and sequence of the career of the most wonderful American. So I think we can understand the motives from that statement and the fact that he's probably going to be very positive in his conclusions about Benjamin Franklin and his contributions to the founding of our nation. So this is not going to be a very critical secondary source here. Let's look at one of the other examples, okay? This one is from 1911 from George Upton. Before we even read the text, what can we find out about this work? Well, from the very first thing here, it says Life Stories for Young People. So that's the series that this belongs to, and that gives away right away what the audience is. And you can tell even from the fact that it includes some pictures that this is probably for young people. And so what does the translator's preface say, for instance? The life of Benjamin Franklin as statesman, philosopher, humanitarian, scientist, and patriot, the eminent services he performed for his country, and the extraordinary wisdom and prudence of his well-ordered life are matters which are or should be well known to American youth. So we know what they're going to focus on when they're telling the story. A lot of his scientific innovations, I imagine, plus his contributions to the Declaration of Independence and the Continental Congress. But also we know the purpose of this. This is to set a good moral example for young people in America at that time that it was published, which would have been 1911. So all right, most people would want something a bit more up to date though, right? So let's look at some of the other types of secondary sources at the Library of Congress. And I'm going to go back and refer to some that I mentioned in the previous webinar. This is from the digital collection called the Library of Congress Celebrates the Songs of America. And I picked this because it just has so many articles and essays available in this third tab. And so if you click on them, you can see that, for instance, I'm going to look at Blues's Protest as an example. For some reason, the image is not showing up right here. You can just refresh it till that happens. So here we have an essay. It doesn't have an author's name on it, but it was written by a librarian at the Library of Congress. It does have 2 footnotes. The footnotes, though, are referring to other secondary sources. So in a way, this is using secondary sources, but it is also using primary sources. So all of these links are to specific songs in the collections, which they're using as primary sources. And so that would make this a secondary source that analyzes the primary sources and that you could use for informational purposes. It's probably not so much for being persuasive or putting forth a controversial argument, but those are always a factor to look for in any case. So these seem more useful for students or the general public. Why would you want to use these old ones at all? The last thing that I would just want to mention is something important to remember, which is secondary sources are still primary sources. It just depends on what questions you're asking about them. So it's good to look at them in context and how do they contribute? How do they fit in? How do they change the way that we talk about a topic? How are they affected by the time in which they were written? and in which they're read. So that's the last thing I want to mention. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.